Hello and welcome to the problem of evil. Before we get going today, on this philosophy unit, that is the problem of evil, we're going to look at some key terms. Before we do that even, let's deliver the paradox. So what is it? Problem of evil. Evil is a problem to the God of classical theism. Simply put, if God is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient, or loving, or powerful, and all knowing, then there is no capacity for evil to exist in the world. Yet clearly, through events like the Holocaust or any other event of mass genocide or murder, clearly there are examples of evil in the world, which begs the question: God cannot exist, or at least cannot have all of those qualities. That's the problem. That's the paradox that we're going to try and unravel. We're going to try and reconcile. And like ultimately, you need to decide which side of the argument you fall on. I mean, obviously, theists or Christians are going to endeavour to do the very best they can to defend God, and atheists, well, I think we've already seen their line of argument. So, first and foremost, let's look at some of the key terms. The first one we're going to look at is moral evil, and this is evil that is a result of human actions and choices. Next, we have non-moral evil. This is evil such as found in nature and owes nothing to human choice. Suffering, the state of undergoing pain. Natural evil is clearly that produced by things like hurricanes and tornadoes. Deism. Deism, this is the concept that God created the universe and then died. And this model is perhaps presented to us in the story of Genesis. Perhaps rested implies dead. So deism is one that perhaps is you can have a God that creator ex nihilo, that created, and then that God obviously died, and that does open the door for even suffering. But of course, it does not mean that God is a sustainer, that God is eternal, because obviously He is dead. So it does undermine much of the God of classical theism. Also, I'd like to introduce something called the inconsistent triad. This is proposed by somebody called Epicurus and David Hume. And this is the fact that God is all powerful, so He should or could have prevented evil, but didn't. God is all knowing, therefore would have foreseen evil coming, but didn't stop it, and is all loving, therefore would care, but doesn't seem to. This whole kind of inconsistency is known as the inconsistent triad. We are then going to be looking at theodicies. Now, theodicies that attempt to justify the goodness of God in the face of evil. So these are things, arguments essentially that Christians would present. We're going to be looking at the notion of original sin, which is when Adam and Eve first ate the apple, and as a result of that, humanity became flawed and became chained to original sin ever since. So we need to obviously be aware of some of those key words which I'll be whizzing through. The logical problem of evil. The logical form of the argument tries to show a logical impossibility, which we've already looked at. Okay, in the coexistence of God and evil, there is a logical, there as we say, a logical problem here for evil. If God were all knowing, it seems that God would have known all about the horrible things that were about to happen in our world. If God were all powerful, God of course would do something about it, and if He's all loving, He would care. So, where does this leave us? Evil is a problem for all, theist, atheist, and agnostic. People offer qualifications for evil in the world. Perhaps God moves in mysterious ways, but this is a very flimsy argument. So we've got to perhaps have a look at maybe the purpose of evil if we are to endeavour to reconcile the goodness of God alongside evil. What purpose does it serve? I mean, for example, a famous scholar called John Hick would argue that actually it serves a veil-making process. In other words, it is nurturing and developing our soul. Possibly, it's certainly a theology he delivered. Here's a purpose of evil. The distribution of evil is highly disproportionate. So, for example, the developing world, why is that some people perhaps seem to have more evil than others, and ultimately they may all go to the same place? Seems quite unfair. Okay, so we're going to look first and foremost at Augustine's theodicy. Augustine's theodicy is a soul-deciding theodicy. So he taught it is about limited election. In other words, only a few of us will actually become saved. And it follows a traditional view of God. In fact, Augustine uses Genesis 1 to 3 to endeavor to defend God from sin, I should say. So it's an interpretation of the Bible, a literal interpretation. Obviously, Augustine was a fundamentalist, and it hinges on the notion that God gave Adam and Eve, in fact, humanity, free will to us. And therefore, with free will, a prerequisite is that we are free to commit sin, thus shifting the blame from God. It's our fault. God is ultimately, therefore, not responsible for evil. Or is he? If he gave us free will, then perhaps he is. However, Augustine is more slippery than that and cleverer than that. He then proceeds to say that evil is a privation, not a substance that has been created, rather a lack of goodness. And therefore, perhaps it is not something that we should perhaps pin on anyone, say they are responsible for. We don't have here is pure, unadulterated evil, for example. So evil is perhaps something that doesn't exist, but rather is a lack of goodness. Augustine talks about the fall and how humanity fell from grace from committing original sin. And as a result, humanity, was what he called seminally present. In other words, we were present in Adam. I don't think I need to allude any further into what that means. So God was present in Adam. Therefore, we are all morally responsible and therefore are all essentially damned. So originally, we were in a state of paradise and perfection until Adam and Eve ate the apple. You could argue we did that. We put ourselves there, and that perhaps it takes a benevolent God to actually perhaps to show grace and actually save a number of us, which he has endeavored to do, so showing us limited election. God gives humans free will to choose and respond also to respond to him out of our own free choosing, our own free choice. And that is really important. And humans therefore knowingly make a choice whether to choose God or to thus close this epistemic distance or increase it, and thus by sinning when choosing a life of sin. We choose according to Augustine. So the fall has essentially initially made that epistemic gap grow, but actually through choosing Christ, Christians believe that actually they can close it further. Okay, so some of the strengths and weaknesses associated with that. Evil is a privation. Evil is a gap between what there is and what there ought to be. A privation is, Brian Davis would possibly disagree with that. He would, however, agree with Augustine on this whole notion of this epistemic gap, which we have the capability of closing. Probably at this point, it's a good idea to look at Hick after looking at some more criticisms. Obviously, Darwin presents the model that actually humanity is evolving, where obviously Augustine seems to place blame on humanity, and that we seem to be devolving, we seem to be going backwards, and to use Genesis 1 to 3 as if you like, as a scientific textbook. Well, was it ever really meant for that? And can we really use it as a source of authority? An atheist would certainly argue, no, we certainly can't use it as a source of authority. We then scoot on to, because I'm just conscious of time, onto Hick and Irenaeus. Now, Hick and Irenaeus are often gelled together. There is a subtle difference which we will explore in a moment. Essentially, both believe, unlike Augustine, where we started at the top or we started at the state of perfection, we actually were created merely in God's image. And through even suffering, we are able to grow in actually the likeness of God. So created in God's image, but through even suffering, we grow in God's likeness. And that is to say, therefore, that even suffering is a necessary ingredient in order for, to quote Hick, for the veil of soul-making process to occur. Without the veil of soul-making, we would remain in a morally static world where we would not grow and we would remain spiritually immature and therefore not ready for heaven. We are all, according to John Hick, on the road to heaven. He therefore subscribes to the process of unlimited election, where ultimately everyone will get to heaven. However, if post mortem that we haven't achieved our journey, we continue it. And this perhaps is what you could argue purgatory is. Possibly it's a continuation of this journey, this veil of soul making, so that we are ready. However, there is a subtle difference here, because Irenaeus does not believe or subscribe to unlimited election. Rather, he would say that if you unfortunately have not grown sufficiently in your life, then forget it. You have fallen short and you are damned to hell. So we start off spiritually immature, and through evil and suffering, we grow in God's likeness. Now, it is therefore that evil and suffering is a product of two things. God has purposely put evil and suffering there, and there we have a criticism. Why would God collude with events such as evil and suffering in order for us to grow? Seems to be a bit dodgy. Incidentally, the other reason there is even suffering there is as a result of the misuse of free will that obviously you and I sometimes commit. The other, perhaps real negative with both Hick and Irenaeus is, okay, get the concept of spiritual growth all sounds quite good in the abstract, but actually when we start applying it to practical events, for example, such as the Holocaust, why does God need such extremities of evil in order for us to grow? I mean, enable us perhaps stub our toe on a stone or something, but not get, have to consider family members like Otto Frank, for example, was the only individual walking away from Auschwitz post 1945. I mean, it was that extremities of evil. Really, an all-loving God, would he really use that as an apparator in order for us to grow even? I mean, some of the positives, of course, it offers an explanation of suffering as well as evil. It fits in with contemporary view that evil can arise from the exercising of free will, and it fits with science as well, evolution, that humans are progressing. So some really nice aspects there to both Hick and Irenaeus. A few negatives, argues that the ends justify the means. The ends being heaven justifies all the suffering that we might go through. Bit morally dubious. And why is evil, as we've talked about before, so disproportionate? And why are humans created morally imperfect? Why not create as perfect in the first place? If God is good, he could create free creatures that actually always endeavor to do what is good. Good luck, guys. 13 minutes, better stop.